They called him the widow of Rothmay, and they said his first wife's ghost still walked the halls of his estate because he had loved her too little to let her rest. Lady Iris Whitmore knew better than to believe drawing-room gossip, but even she felt a chill when her father told her whose name had been signed to the marriage contract that would save their family from ruin. She expected silence, grief, and a husband who looked through her like glass. What she found instead, behind the locked doors of Rothmay Abbey, was a man guarding a secret far more dangerous than a broken heart. The library at Whitmore House smelled of dust and old regret. Iris stood before her father's desk with her hands folded, the posture her governess had drilled into her since childhood. Spine straight, chin level, no tremor in the fingers no matter what news arrived. She had learned young that Baron Whitmore's study was not a room for weeping. It was a room for numbers, and her father had never been kind to the numbers, or they to him. "The Duke of Rothmore has agreed to the settlement," her father said without looking up from the ledger he'd been avoiding for a week. His voice had a particular flatness of a man reciting something he did not wish to feel. "Your dowry is nothing to speak of, but he does not require one. He requires a wife of good birth, and he requires her quickly." Iris studied the crown of her father's balding head, the way his hand shook faintly as he dipped his pen. "And in exchange, our debts to Grayson and Hale are settled in full. The mortgage on this house is cleared. You will want for nothing as a duchess. Iris, whatever else is said of him." "Whatever else is said of him," Iris repeated. She had heard the whisper, same as everyone in London had, that the Duke of Rothmore's young wife had died at Rothmay 3 years past under circumstances nobody in the family would discuss, that the Duke himself had not danced, dined, or spoken more than a dozen words to any woman in society since, that he kept her far north of the country in a house the local villagers were said to avoid after dark. She had heard him cold. She had heard him cold cursed. She had never heard anyone call him unkind, which she supposed, in her family's current circumstances, might have to be enough. "You know the talk," her father said, glancing up at last, his eyes bloodshot from drink and worse hours than drink at the card tables. "I'll not pretend otherwise. But a grieving man is not a monster, Iris, whatever the papers print to sell themselves. He needs an heir. He needs a household run competently. You have never given me a moment's trouble in your life, and God knows I've given you every reason to cause some. This is the last thing I will ever ask of you." It was not, Iris understood, actually a request. She had known since she was 14 years old and had watched the bailiff carry the good silver out of this very house that her value to her family had always been measured in precisely 2 ways, the name she carried, and the price some desperate lord would eventually pay for it. She had stopped resenting the arithmetic some years ago. Resentment cost energy she needed for other things. "I understand," she said, and meant it, and left the study before her father could see whatever expression had nearly escaped her composure. She met the Duke of Rothmore for the first time 4 days later, at a small private supper arranged by the family solicitors rather than any society hostess, a detail Iris noted with something like relief. She had dreaded the idea of being paraded before London's drawing-rooms as a bride-to-be of the notorious widow of Rothmay, subject to the same cruel, curious stare she imagined had once been turned on him. He arrived late, which she would later learn was not rudeness but simple forgetfulness. The Duke kept appalling track of time when absorbed in his own thoughts, and when he finally stepped into the small dining room at her aunt's house on Curzon Street, Iris found herself surprised by how entirely he failed to resemble the spectre of gossip. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way his plainly cut black coat did nothing to disguise, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so thoroughly guarded. His eyes were a deep, unreadable brown, and they moved over the room with the wary precision of a man counting exits. When he bowed to her, the gesture was correct in every particular and warm in none. "Lady Iris," he said. His voice was low, quiet, roughened at the edges as though he did not use it often enough to keep it smooth. Your servant, your grace. She dipped into a curtsy that had cost her governess a great many hours to perfect. I understand we are to be married. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, there and gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. You are direct. I have found directness saves everyone a great deal of tedious pretending, your grace. I am aware this is an arrangement of necessity on both sides. I do not require you to court me with false sentiment. He studied her for a long moment, and Iris made herself hold his gaze rather than look away, though something in the intensity of his attention made her want to. No, he said finally, I imagine you do not. He gestured toward the table, where the solicitors and her aunt were already taking their seats with the studied casualness of people pretending not to watch. Shall we? The supper passed in stilted, careful conversation, the Duke answering questions about the weather and the state of the northern roads with a courtesy so precise it bordered on rehearsed, while Iris watched him with the same attention she gave to a ledger that did not balance, searching for the place where the numbers failed to add up. She found it only once, late in the evening, when her aunt made an offhand remark about how lovely it would be for Rothmere to have a mistress again after so long standing empty of one. The Duke's hand, resting on the stem of his wine-glass, went very still. He said nothing. He did not correct her aunt, did not deflect with a joke the way a more practiced society gentleman might have. He simply sat, jaw tight, until the conversation moved on without him, and Iris understood in that small, quiet moment that whatever had happened at Rothmere 3 years ago, the wound of it had not closed. She wondered, not for the first time, exactly what she was agreeing to marry into. The engagement lasted 3 weeks, most of it consumed by fittings and legal correspondence Iris was permitted no part in, though she noticed, with some interest, that the settlement papers arriving from the Duke's solicitors were unusually generous, not merely toward her father's debt, but toward Iris herself, with provisions for her independent maintenance that went well beyond what custom required. When she asked her father's solicitor about it, the man had simply said the Duke had insisted, and would hear no argument on the matter, which told Iris either that her betrothed was a man of unusual conscience, or a man who felt he owed a debt to whichever wife he next acquired that had nothing to do with affection. She saw him twice more before the wedding, both times at brief chaperone calls that felt more like business meetings and courtship. On the second visit, he arrived carrying a slim parcel wrapped in plain paper, which he set on the table beside her without ceremony. I understand your father sold the contents of your late mother's library some years ago, he said, watching her open it with the same wary stillness he seemed to bring to every interaction. Inside was a book of botanical illustrations, hand-colored, clearly old and clearly valuable. You mentioned once, to your aunt, missing the drawings. I thought you might want them back, in some form. Iris stared at the book, and then at him, uncertain what to say. It was such a small thing, and yet no one, not her father, not any of the fortune-hunting suitors who had briefly circled her before her family's ruin became too well known to ignore, had ever noticed a passing remark of Hayes closely enough to act on it. "Thank you," she managed. "You needn't have—" "I know," he said, and something in the plainness of it, the total absence of flattery, made her believe in more than any flowery speech could have. The wedding itself was small, quiet, held at a country church near her aunt's estate rather than any fashionable London venue, at the Duke's specific request. Iris stood at the altar in a gown of pale grey silk, her own choice, not white, which felt to her like a lie she was unwilling to tell even in fabric, and watched her almost husband approach with the same careful, guarded expression he wore in every room she had seen him in. "Julian, take the Iris," he said when the moment came, his voice steady, and if there was no romance in the words, there was at least an unmistakable weight of sincerity, the tone of a man making a genuine vow rather than reciting an obligation. They left directly for the north, the journey to Roughmere taking the better part of 4 days over increasingly rough roads. The Duke, Julian, she reminded herself she was permitted to call him now, occupying the opposite bench of the carriage with a stack of estate correspondence he read with more focus than he'd yet shown her directly. It was on the 3rd day, as the carriage jolted over a particularly poor stretch of road, and the autumn rain turned to something closer to sleet against the windows, that he finally set the papers aside and looked at her properly for the first time since they had left London. "You're cold," he said. It was not a question. "I am well, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected, not unkindly, "and you are lying. Your lips have gone faintly blue for the last hour, and you have said nothing because you did not wish to trouble me." He reached for the heavy wool blanket folded on the seat beside him and held out one edge of it. "Roughmere is colder still. You will need to learn to say when you are uncomfortable, or you will spend the rest of your life freezing out of politeness." Iris hesitated, then slid across the bench to accept the offered warmth, careful to keep a respectable distance between them even as she drew the blanket over her knees. "Thank you." "The house is isolated," he said, watching the gray landscape roll past the window rather than her. "There are no close neighbors. The nearest village is 4 miles distant, and half the year the roads are impassable with snow. I will not pretend it is not a hard place to live, particularly for someone accustomed to town. I have very little fondness left for town, Your Grace." "Julian," she corrected herself at his glance, "I find I am not sorry to be leaving it." He turned to study her then, an expression on his face she could not quite name, something between surprise and a wary, cautious hope, as though he had expected her to complain and did not know what to do with the fact that she hadn't. "Roughmere has not had a mistress in some years," he said carefully. "The staff are loyal, but the house has fallen into a certain quiet. I would not blame you if you found it difficult." "I have lived a great many years in a house that was quiet for very different reasons," Iris said. "I believe I can manage." He did not answer that directly, but something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, and they rode the rest of that day in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like strangers enduring one another's company and more like two people beginning, cautiously, to occupy the same space. Roughmere Abbey came into view on the evening of the 4th day, and Iris understood immediately why the villagers were said to give it a wide berth after dark. It was enormous, built of dark northern stone that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the sky, its towers rising against the horizon like something out of the Gothic novels her aunt had always disapproved of her reading. It should have frightened her. Instead, gazing up at it through the carriage window as the horses climbed the final rise toward the gates, Iris felt something closer to recognition, as though she were looking at a larger, grander reflection of her own guarded, private self. The household staff stood assembled in the entrance hall to receive them. Rows of servants Iris would spend the next weeks learning the names of, presided over by a stern, silver-haired housekeeper introduced as Mrs. Prescott, whose sharp eyes assessed Iris with a thoroughness that made her feel, not unkindly, precisely measured. "Welcome to Roughmere, Your Grace," Mrs. Prescott said, with a courtesy that managed to convey both respect and reservation in equal measure. "Thank you, Mrs. Prescott," Iris said, and saw something in the older woman's expression soften very slightly at being addressed directly rather than through her husband. Julian gave brief, efficient instructions for Iris's things to be taken to her rooms, for a hot bath and supper to be arranged, and then, with a bow so formal it felt almost like a retreat, excused himself to his study, leaving Iris to be led up the sweeping stone staircase by Mrs. Prescott, alone in a house that was now, improbably, her own. Her rooms were vast, decorated in deep greens and warm but handsome oak furniture, a fire already crackling in the hearth against the evening chill. Iris bathed, ate a solitary supper brought up on a tray, and sat at the edge of the enormous bed in a plain linen nightgown, looking at the heavy door that connected her chamber to the Duke's, and found she did not know, after 4 days of careful proximity and one small, unexpected gift of book, what to expect of the night ahead. The knock, when it came, was soft, almost hesitant, entirely unlike the confident, guarded man she had spent the last month learning to read. "Come in," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. Julian stood in the doorway in shirt-sleeves, his formal coat and cravat discarded somewhere in his own chamber, a single candle in his hand casting long shadows across features that looked, in this unguarded light, younger and more uncertain than she had yet seen them. "I did not wish to presume," he said. "I know the nature of our arrangement does not require sentiment, but I would not have you think I intend to simply claim what the contract allows, without regard for what you wish." Iris considered him for a long moment, this large, careful man standing in her doorway asking permission rather than assuming entitlement, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, with some alarm, as a beginning of trust. "I appreciate your Grace's consideration," she said carefully, "but I confess I do not entirely know what I wish, beyond honesty. If there is something you are not telling me about this house, about your first wife, about why you needed a bride so urgently that you settled a debt-ridden family's contract within a month of meeting me, I would rather hear it from you than piece it together from the servants' whispers." Something crossed his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it fully, though she thought it might have been fair. "That is a fair request," he said quietly, "and you deserve an honest answer. But it is not a short one, and it is not one I am prepared to give standing in a doorway at midnight, exhausted from 4 days of travel." He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression was entirely unguarded. "Will you trust me with a few days more before I tell you everything? I promise you, Iris, it is not what the gossip says. It is worse, in some ways, and better in others. But it will keep until you have had a chance to rest and to see this place with clear eyes rather than a stranger's fare." Iris studied him. This man she had married for her family's survival, and knew almost nothing about beyond a book of pressed flowers and the particular quality of his silences. She thought of every calculation her family had ever made about her worth, every cold arithmetic of debt and duty that had brought her to this vast, dark house at the edge of the world, and found, standing there in the candlelight with a stranger asking for her trust rather than assuming his due, that she wanted, quite fiercely, to give him the chance to prove himself different from every other bargain she had ever been party to. "Very well," she said, "a few days, but I will hold you to the honesty, your Grace." "Julian," he said again, softly, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Good night, Iris." He did not stay. He bowed, formal even in his shirt-sleeves, and withdrew back through a connecting door, and Iris lay awake a long while afterward, listening to the wind moving through the old stones of Rothmay Abbey, wondering what secret could possibly be worse than the gossip and better than it at once. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Iris had not expected to find comforting so quickly. She rose early, walked the grounds while the morning mist still clung to the moorland grass, and spent her afternoons with Mrs. Prescott learning the vast, complicated machinery of running a household the size of Rothmay, the tenant farms, the accounts, the endless small crises of a great house that never quite ran itself. She found, to her own surprise, that she was good at it. Her father's chaotic finances had taught her, inadvertently, an excellent eye for a ledger that did not balance, and within a fortnight she had identified 2 separate instances of a steward padding invoices for repairs that had never actually been made. Julian, when she brought the discrepancies to him in his study one rainy afternoon, looked at the figures she had circled and then at her with an expression of frank astonishment. "How did you find this?" "My father's gambling taught me a great deal about how numbers can be made to lie," Iris said. "I have simply learned to ask the ledger the right questions." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way he sometimes did, as though recalculating some private estimation of her. "I dismissed a man for exactly this kind of theft 2 years ago," he said finally. I did not think to check whether his replacement had learned the same tricks. Thank you, Iris. Truly. It was the first time he had thanked her for something that was not a small courtesy, and Iris found she liked the particular warmth in his voice when he said it rather more than she was prepared to admit. Their evenings, too, had begun to change shape. What had begun as stilted, formal suppers eaten largely in silence had, over the course of that first fortnight, softened into something closer to genuine conversation. Julian asking after a day's discoveries in the account books, Iris asking, cautiously, about the estate's history, the tenants, the sprawling northern land he clearly loved with a fierce, quiet intensity he rarely let show in company. It was on one such evening, the fire burning low and the last of the wine gone from their glasses, that Iris finally found the courage to press the question she had been holding since their wedding night. "You promised me honesty," she said quietly, "about this house, about your first wife. I have given you your few days, Julian." He set down his glass carefully, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring into the fire with a particular stillness she had come to recognize as a shape his fear took when he would not let it show on his face. "Margaret died of a fever," he said finally, 3 years ago this winter. Not murder, not neglect, not any of a dozen cruel stories London has invented over the years to explain why I stopped attending their balls. She fell ill in November, and by Christmas she was gone, and there was nothing the physicians could do, and nothing I could do, except sit beside her and watch. His jaw tightened. That part of the gossip, at least, is simply grief dressed up as scandal because grief alone was not interesting enough to sustain 3 years of drawing-room speculation. "I am sorry," Iris said softly, and meant it. "That is not a secret, Julian. That is simply a sorrow. You did not need 3 days to tell me that." "No," he agreed. "The rest of it is harder." He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out at the dark moors beyond the glass. "My father's will contain the clause I have never disclosed to anyone outside my solicitors. Rothmay itself, the title, those pass to me regardless. But the greater part of the estate's unentailed land and income, nearly 2/3 of what keeps this house and these tenants fed, was left conditional. I was required to remarry and produce an heir within 5 years of Margaret's death, or that portion of the estate passes entirely to my cousin, Percival Vane." Iris frowned. 5 years is not so urgent a timeline as to require the haste with which you married me. "It would not be if Percival were an idle man content to wait out the clock," Julian said, and something bitter entered his voice for the first time since she had known him. "He is not. Percival has spent the last 2 years quietly buying up debts owed by half the gentry in 3 counties, mine included, positioning himself to force circumstances that would either discredit me publicly or push the estate into a state of disorder severe enough that a court might intervene to strip my management of it before the 5 years are even up. He has friends on the bench, Iris. He has friends in Parliament. I have watched him circle this estate like a carrion bird for 2 years, and I married in haste not merely to satisfy my father's clause, but because every month I remained unmarried was another month Percival used to whisper in the right ears that the Duke of Rothmore was unfit, unstable, incapable of producing an heir at all, and that the estate would be better managed in more capable hands. His hands! "And you did not think to tell me this before the wedding," Iris said, not quite an accusation, though it was close. "I did not think it fair to burden you with a war you had not chosen, on top of a marriage you had not chosen either," Julian said, turning from the window to look at her directly. "You had enough thrust upon you by your father's debts without my adding my cousin's ambitions to the weight of it. I intended to tell you eventually. I did not expect—" He stopped, something almost helpless crossing his face. "I did not expect to find myself wanting you to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with the clause at all." Iris felt something in her chest tighten at that, a feeling she did not yet have a name for and was not certain she was ready to examine. What does Percival intend to do now that you are married? I do not know, Julian admitted, but I know him well enough to say it will not be nothing. He will find some new angle. He always does. He did not have to wait long to be proven right. The letter arrived 11 days later, carried up from the village by a rider who had clearly pushed his horse hard over the muddy roads to deliver it. Iris was in the study reviewing the tenant accounts when Mrs. Prescott brought it in, her expression tight with a particular wariness she reserved for correspondence bearing the Vane family seal. Julian read it standing, his face going through a slow, careful transformation from neutral to something colder, harder, as his eyes moved down the page. When he finished, he handed it to Iris without a word. The letter was from Percival Vane himself, its tone dripping with a cousinly warmth so insincere it made Iris's skin crawl even on the page. He wrote to offer his congratulations on the marriage, express his eagerness to visit Roughmere and make the new Duchess's acquaintance, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought in the letter's final paragraph, that he had recently come into possession of certain correspondence between Margaret and her physician in the weeks before her death, correspondence that, he delicately suggested, raised troubling questions about the adequacy of care she had received, questions he felt certain the courts overseeing the estate's conditional inheritance would find most relevant to any future determination of the current Duke's fitness to manage Roughmere's affairs. He is threatening to claim you neglected her, Iris said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold, sick clarity. To use her death itself as grounds to challenge your management of the estate. Yes, Julian said grimly, and he will fabricate whatever correspondence he requires to make the claim look credible. Percival has never let the absence of actual evidence trouble him when a convincing forgery would serve just as well. Then we must find proof of the forgery before he can present it, Iris said, already moving toward the desk, reaching for paper and pen with the brisk, decisive energy she brought to any ledger that did not balance. Who was Margaret's physician? Is he still living? Could he be found and asked directly whether any such correspondence exists? Julian stared at her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting from grim resignation into something closer to startled hope. Dr. Aldous Finch, he said slowly. He retired to Harrogate 2 years ago. I have not spoken to him since Margaret's funeral. Then we shall speak to him now, Iris said. Julian, if your cousin intend to fight this with fabricated papers, our best offense is the truth, gathered and documented before he can bury it under his lies. I did not spend a childhood watching my father's creditors circle our house to learn nothing of how such men operate. You corner them with facts faster than they can invent new fictions. Something in Julian's face, watching her across the study with the letter still trembling faintly in his hand, softened into an expression Iris had not yet seen from him. Not quite a smile, but something warmer, steadier, the look of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time since his father's will have been read, that he was no longer facing his cousin's schemes entirely alone. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I confess I did not expect a wife of convenience to take up arms so readily on my behalf. I did not marry you for convenience alone, whatever the settlement papers said," Iris replied, surprising herself with the honesty of it even as she said it. "I find I have very little patience for men like your cousin, who build their fortunes on other people's ruin. I had quite enough of watching that particular game played against my own family. I do not intend to watch it played against yours." They left for Harrogate 2 days later, a journey of some 6 hours over roads made treacherous by an early frost, Julian insisting on driving the smaller, faster curricle himself rather than wait for the heavy travelling carriage to be readied. Iris sat beside him wrapped in furs against the biting cold, watching the moorland give way gradually to gentler, more cultivated country, and found herself, despite the grim purpose of their errand, unexpectedly content in the silence between them, a silence that no longer felt like the careful distance of strangers, but something closer to the comfortable quiet of two people who had begun, in the space of a few short weeks, to trust one another with the truth. Dr. Aldous Finch proved to be a stooped, sharp-eyed man in his 60s, living in a modest cottage on the edge of Harrogate with a housekeeper and an enormous, disapproving cat that regarded Iris with open suspicion from its perch on the windowsill throughout their entire visit. He received them in a cluttered study lined with medical texts, and his expression, upon hearing the purpose of their call, shifted quickly from polite confusion to sharp, focused alarm. "Correspondence suggesting I gave inadequate care to the late Duchess," he said, incredulous. "Your Grace, I wrote precisely 4 letters to you regarding your wife's condition during her illness, and I have retained copies of every one, as is my habit with all serious cases. I can produce them for you this very hour. There is no correspondence in existence that could honestly be construed as raising any question of neglect. The fever that took her was virulent and fast-moving, and I brought in 2 additional physicians from York for consultation within days of her first symptoms. If your cousin possesses letters suggesting otherwise, Your Grace, I assure you they are not letters I wrote." He was as good as his word, producing within the half-hour a small locked box containing careful copies of every piece of correspondence exchanged during Margaret's illness, along with the signed consultation notes of the 2 additional physicians he had summoned, notes that made unambiguously clear the swift, thorough, and ultimately futile efforts made to save her. Iris watched Julian's hand shake, very slightly, as he read through the papers, old grief resurfacing alongside the fierce, protective anger of a man watching his cousin attempt to weaponize his wife's death for profit. "Would you be willing to testify to this, if it comes to that?" Julian asked quietly, once he had regained his composure. "I would not ask it of you lightly, Dr. Finch. My cousin is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully, and I would not wish to expose you to whatever unpleasantness he might attempt in retaliation." "Your Grace," Dr. Finch said, drawing himself up with quiet dignity, "I have practiced medicine in this county for 40 years, and I have watched more than one good family torn apart by men exactly like the cousin you describe, using grief as a weapon against the grieving. I would be glad to testify. Margaret Ashgrove was a kind woman and a good patient who never once complained in the whole terrible course of her illness, and I'll not have her memory used as ammunition by a man who never troubled himself to visit her sickbed even once in the 6 weeks she lay dying." Something in Julian's face, hearing that, seemed to crack open entirely, not into distress, but into a kind of fierce, grateful relief, and Iris, watching him thank the old physician with a warmth she had not yet seen him extend to anyone outside their own household, felt something in her own chest settle more firmly into place. Whatever else this marriage was, whatever practical bargain had brought them together, she understood now with total clarity that she was fighting alongside a man worth fighting for. They returned to Rothmere with Dr. Finch's sworn copy secured in a locked dispatch box, only to find, upon their arrival, that Percival Vane had not waited for an invitation. His carriage stood already in the courtyard, and Mrs. Prescott met them at the door with the tight, apologetic expression of a woman who had been given no polite way to refuse a guest bearing the family name and a claim, however distant, to eventual ownership of the house she managed. "He arrived yesterday afternoon, Your Grace," Mrs. Prescott said in a low voice as she took Iris's traveling cloak. "Said he'd heard rumors of your absence and thought it his cousinly duty to check the household was being properly managed in your stead. I have put him in the blue guest room, though I confess I do not like the way he has been asking the star questions." Julian's jaw tightened, but his voice, when he spoke, was carefully controlled. "What sort of questions?" "About the late Duchess's final illness, Your Grace. About the household accounts. About whether the new Duchess has been seen to keep to herself, or whether there have been any unusual disturbances in the house." Mrs. Prescott's mouth thinned with clear distaste. "I told him nothing beyond what any properly run household would say to a guest, but I did not care for his manner, Your Grace, nor his questions." Percival Vane received them in the drawing-room with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who believed himself already halfway to victory. He was perhaps 10 years Julian's senior, silver-templed and expensively dressed, with a thin, pleasant smile that did not extend to his pale, calculating eyes. "Cousin," he said, rising with unhurried grace as they entered. "And the new Duchess, I presume. What a pleasure finally to make your acquaintance, Lady Iris. I confess I had begun to wonder whether Julian intended to keep you entirely hidden away up here, away from society's prying eyes." His gaze moved over her with an assessing coolness that made Iris's skin crawl. "Understandable, perhaps, given the circumstances of your family's rather sudden need for this particular alliance." "Percival," Julian said, his voice gone flat and cold in a way Iris had not yet heard from him. "You will forgive us if we did not expect the pleasure of your company quite so soon, nor quite so unannounced." "I thought it best to come directly," Percival said, settling back into his chair with the air of a man entirely at ease in a house he did not yet own but clearly considered his eventual due. "Especially given the rather troubling correspondence I mentioned in my last letter. I should hate for matters to proceed to the courts without giving you every opportunity to address my concerns directly, cousin to cousin, as family ought." "We had just returned from Harrogate," Julian said, setting the locked dispatch box on the table between them with deliberate, controlled precision. "From a most illuminating conversation with Dr. Aldous Finch, Margaret's physician throughout her final illness." He was rather surprised, Percival, to learn that correspondence existed in his name suggesting any negligence in her care. He was, in fact, entirely unaware of any such letters, given that he never wrote them. For the first time since they had entered the room, something flickered across Percival's composed features. Not quite alarm, but the sharp, quick recalculation of a man realizing his opening move had been anticipated. "Forgeries are easily claimed and rarely proven. Cousin," he said smoothly, recovering his composure with practised speed. "One elderly physician's protestations, made under the obvious pressure of his patron's displeasure, will hardly stand a conclusive proof before a court inclined to sympathy for a grieving widower's cousin acting only out of concern for the estate's proper management. Dr. Finch has provided sworn, dated copies of every letter he genuinely wrote during Margaret's illness, along with the consultation notes of 2 additional physicians he summoned from York," Iris said, stepping forward before Julian could respond, her voice carrying the same flat, precise coldness she had once used against the vultures of London society circling her own family's ruin. "I imagine, Mr. Vane, that any forged correspondence you intend to present will not match the paper stock, ink composition, or handwriting of these genuine originals under close examination. Forgeries are indeed easily claimed. They are considerably harder to sustain against actual, dated, witnessed evidence." Percival's pale eyes fixed on her with something like genuine surprise, the polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculating annoyance beneath. "The new Duchess is remarkably well informed for a woman married scarcely a month," he said. "The new Duchess spent a great many years watching her father's creditors attempt precisely this kind of maneuver against a family with far less capacity to defend itself than Rothmay possesses," Iris replied evenly. I find I have developed rather a keen eye for men who mistake other people's grief and misfortune for opportunity, Mr. Vane. I would advise you not to underestimate how thoroughly that particular experience has prepared me to recognize your methods. Percival rose slowly from his chair, straightening his coat with exaggerated care, though Iris did not miss the tightness that had entered his jaw. "It seems I have arrived at an inopportune moment," he said. "I shall take my leave and allow you both to enjoy your evidence, such as it is. I trust we shall speak again, cousin, when the courts have had opportunity to weigh the matter properly." He paused at the door, turning back with one last, thin smile. "Do give my regards to the tenants, Julian. I understand 3 of the roof repairs on the eastern cottages have gone unfinished this autumn. One does hope the estate's finances are being managed with sufficient rigor under its current stewardship." The door closed behind him with a soft, deliberate click, and the room seemed to exhale. "He will not simply retreat," Julian said quietly, once the sound of Percival's carriage wheels had faded down the drive. "That was not a surrender. That was a man recalculating his approach." "I know," Iris said, "but we have bought ourselves time, and time to prepare a proper defense is worth a great deal more than the illusion of an easy victory tonight." She looked at him, this careful, guarded man who had spent 3 years building walls around a grief he'd never been permitted to simply feel in peace, and felt something in her chest ache with an emotion far too large and far too sudden to examine closely. "You are not facing this alone, Julian. Whatever else this marriage was meant to be, I find I have no intention of standing aside while your cousin attempts to dismantle everything you have built here." Julian crossed the room slowly, and stopped before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion and old grief etched around his eyes, softened now by something warmer, something that had not been there on their wedding day. "I did not expect this," he admitted, his voice rough. "I'm married for the clause, Iris. I'm married because my fathers would demanded it, and because Percival's ambitions may delay a luxury I could not afford. I did not expect to find, in the woman my solicitor selected from a list of eligible, sensible candidates, someone who would fight for this house, and for me, as though we had chosen each other freely." "Perhaps we are choosing each other now," Iris said softly. "Whatever brought us together in the first place." He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back as she wished it, and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "May I kiss you, Iris?" "Yes," she whispered, and when his mouth met hers, there was none of the guarded formality that had defined every interaction between them since their wedding day, only a quiet, searching tenderness that spoke more honestly than any of his careful words had yet managed. When they finally parted, Julian rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I find," he murmured, "that I am no longer entirely certain which parts of this arrangement were ever truly a bargain, and which parts became, somewhere in the last month, simply my heart's own choosing." "Then let us stop calling it a bargain," Iris said, "and call it what it is becoming instead." The weeks that followed brought a warmth to Rothmere Abbey that Mrs. Prescott privately confided to Iris she had not seen in the house since long before Margaret's illness, perhaps not since old Duke's own happier years. Julian's guarded silences softened by degrees into genuine conversation, his rare, careful smiles becoming less rare with every week that passed. Iris took over the full management of the household accounts, uncovering and correcting years of small inefficiencies with the same ruthless, careful as she had once turned on her own father's chaotic finances, and found in a work of satisfaction she had never expected marriage to offer her. But Percival Vane, true to Julian's prediction, did not simply retreat into quiet defeat. Word reached them through Julian's London solicitors, some 3 weeks after the confrontation at Rothmere, that Percival had begun quietly petitioning several members of the Chancery Court with informal complaints about the Duke's management of the estate, laying groundwork, it seemed, for a more formal challenge once sufficient doubt had been sown. He had also, according to a nervous letter from one of the tenant families, begun making discreet visits to several of Rothmere's tenant farms under the guise of concerned family business, asking pointed questions about rent, repairs, and whether the tenants felt adequately provided for under the current Duke's stewardship. Questions clearly designed to manufacture evidence of neglect where none genuinely existed. "He means to build his case from the ground up," Julian said grimly. Reading the latest report by candlelight one evening in the study, Iris, seated across from him, poring over the household ledgers with the same intent focus. "If he can find even a handful of tenants willing to voice complaints, however minor or however coerced, he will use it as evidence of systemic mismanagement. Then we must ensure the tenants have no cause for complaint, and every reason to speak well of this household when asked," Iris said, setting down her pen. "Julian, when was the last time either of us walked the tenant farms directly, rather than relying on the steward's reports?" He considered the question, and something like chagrin crossed his face. "Not since before Margaret's illness, if I am entirely honest. I have managed the estate from this study for 3 years, trusting the steward's accounts rather than seeing conditions with my own eyes." "Then that is where we begin," Iris said decisively, "not merely to counter Percival's schemes, but because it is simply the right way to manage a household this size. Let us go and see, properly, what condition our own tenants are truly living in." They spent the following week riding out together each morning to the scattered farms across Rothmere's considerable acreage, Julian introducing Iris to families he had not visited in person for years, tenants whose weathered, cautious faces slowly warmed into genuine welcome as they realized the new Duchess intended to listen rather than merely inspect. The visits themselves became, unexpectedly, some of the happiest days of that first strange, uncertain year of Iris's marriage. She learned the names of children who ran barefoot through farmyard mud to gawk at the Duke and Duchess riding past, learned which families kept bees and which kept looms, learned the particular pride an elderly widow named Mrs. Coombe took in a small kitchen garden she had tended for 40 years despite her failing eyesight. Julian, watching Iris crouch in the mud beside Mrs. Coombe's cabbages, listening with genuine interest to the old woman's complaints about slug damage, caught Iris's eye across the garden with an expression of such open, startled affection that she felt the warmth of it in her chest for the rest of that day's ride. "You did not have to kneel in a cabbage patch to win her loyalty," Julian said quietly as they rode back toward the Abbey that evening, the sky streaked gold and violet over the moors. Most duchesses would have sent a servant to inquire after the tenants' welfare and considered their duty amply discharged. Most duchesses did not grow up watching their own family's tenants, what few we had left by the end, go hungry while my father gambled away the rents at cards, Iris said. "I find I have little patience for landowners who manage their people from a distance and call it governance. If I am to be mistress of this estate, I intend to actually know the people whose lives depend on how well we manage it." It was on the 4th day, at a modest farmhouse near the eastern boundary of the estate, that Iris first noticed a discrepancy that would eventually unravel everything. The tenant, a weathered sheep farmer named Josiah Mabb, mentioned in passing, while showing them a leaking section of his cottage roof, that he had paid his steward-collected rent in full each quarter for the past 2 years, precisely as required, And yet the promised repairs to his roof, repairs the steward had assured him were included in his rent agreement and scheduled for completion each spring, had never once materialized. "I did not wish to trouble your grace with it," Mab said, twisting his cap in weathered hands. "Thought perhaps the estate had larger concerns than one leaking roof. But it's not only mine. Begging your pardon. Half the farms on this side have the same complaint, if your grace cares to ask around." Iris exchanged a sharp glance with Julian. "Mr. Mab," she said carefully, "would you be willing to show me your rent receipts, if you have kept them?" He had, as it turned out, kept every receipt with the careful thoroughness of a man who had learned not to trust entirely in a landlord's goodwill. And when Iris compared the figures against the estate's own account books that evening, the discrepancy leapt out at her immediately. Mab's payments, and those of at least 6 other tenant families on the estate's eastern boundary, had been recorded in the official ledgers at figures substantially lower than what the tenants' own receipts confirmed they had actually paid. The difference, carefully hidden across dozens of small transactions over 2 years, amounted to a considerable sum, one that had clearly never reached the estate's genuine accounts, nor funded the repairs it was meant to cover. "Someone has been skimming the rent," Iris said, spreading the comparison across Julian's desk with barely contained fury. "Recording lower figures than tenants actually paid, and pocketing the difference, while letting genuine repairs go undone and blaming the shortfall on the estate's general finances." Julian's face had gone hard as stone as he reviewed the figures. "Mr. Halloway," he said quietly, "my steward. He has managed these accounts for nearly 5 years. And has he any connection to your cousin?" Iris asked, already suspecting the answer even as she asked it. It took only a single carefully worded letter to Julian's London solicitors and a discreet inquiry into Halloway's finances to confirm what both of them had already begun to suspect. Mr. Halloway had, over the past 18 months, received a series of substantial payments from an account traceable, through 2 careful intermediary transfers, directly back to Percival Vane. The steward had not merely been skimming the tenant rent for his own enrichment. He had been doing so at Percival's direction, deliberately manufacturing exactly the kind of tenant grievances and financial shortfalls Percival needed to build his case for the Duke's unfitness to manage the estate, all while quietly funneling the stolen funds into Percival's own accounts as payment for his cooperation. "He has been sabotaging his own cousin's estate from within for over a year," Iris said, staring at the evidence spread across Julian's desk with something between fury and grim satisfaction. "Manufacturing the very neglect he intends to accuse you of, so that when he finally brings his case before the courts, he will have genuine, documented tenant complaints and genuine, documented financial mismanagement to present as evidence he manufactured himself." "It is clever," Julian admitted bitterly. "I will grant him that much. Had you not thought to compare the tenant receipts against the ledgers directly, I doubt we would ever have uncovered it before the damage to my reputation was already done. Then we shall simply have to ensure the truth reaches the right ears before he can present his manufactured version of it," Iris said, already reaching for paper and pen with the same brisk determination she had brought to every crisis since her arrival at Rothmay. "Julian, we have Dr. Finch's testimony regarding Margaret's care, and now we have documented, provable evidence that your own steward was bribed by Percival to deliberately create the very neglect he intends to accuse you of. This is no longer merely a defense against his claims. This is proof of active fraud and conspiracy on his part. I believe, husband, that it is time we stopped merely defending ourselves against your cousin's schemes and began holding him properly accountable for them instead." Confronting Mr. Halloway proved simpler than either of them expected. Faced with the documented evidence of the payments traced to Percival's accounts and the very real prospect of criminal prosecution for embezzlement, the steward's composure crumbled within minutes of Julian's quiet, controlled questioning in the study. He confessed everything: the skimmed rent, The deliberately unfunded repairs, the regular reports he had been sending to Percival detailing exactly which tenant grievances might prove most useful for a future legal challenge, in exchange for Julian's agreement not to pursue criminal charges, provided Holloway put his full confession in writing and testified, if called upon, to the truth of Percival's involvement. The written confession, combined with Dr. Finch's sworn testimony and the banking records tracing Percival's payments to Holloway, made its way to Julian's solicitors within the week, who in turn ensured that the relevant members of the Chancery Court, along with several of Percival's own creditors who had been growing increasingly anxious about the security of their loans to him, received quiet, thorough notice of exactly what evidence existed regarding his conduct. Percival Vane's response, when it came, was not the dignified retreat Iris might have hoped for, but neither was it the sustained legal battle Julian had feared. Faced with the collapse of his manufactured case and the very real threat of prosecution for bribery and fraud, alongside a chorus of nervous creditors suddenly demanding immediate repayment of loans they no longer trusted him to honor, Percival fled north to Scotland within a fortnight, and then, according to the last report Julian's solicitors managed to obtain, took ship for the continent entirely. His considerable debts left unpaid and his ambitions toward Rothmay permanently, definitively, abandoned. "It is over," Julian said quietly, reading the final report by the fireside one evening, some 6 weeks after their confrontation with Percival in the drawing-room. He looked up at Iris, seated across from him with her own book forgotten in her lap, and something in his face had shifted entirely from the guarded, careful man she had married into someone lighter, freer, as though a weight he had carried for 3 long years had finally, genuinely lifted. "He is gone, Iris, truly gone. Rothmay is safe." "We made it safe," Iris corrected gently, setting her book aside and crossing to kneel beside his chair. "Together." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through haze with a tenderness that still, weeks into their genuine courtship within the bones of their arranged marriage, made her breath catch every time. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said quietly. "You arrived at Rothmay a stranger, bound to me by a contract neither of us chose, and within the span of a few short months you have uncovered fraud that had gone undetected for years, defended my late wife's memory against slander, and driven off a cousin who spent 2 years scheming for everything I hold dear. I married a woman I believed I needed for practical necessity, Iris, and I find instead that I have married the truest partner I could ever have hoped for." "I did not expect to find a home here either," Iris admitted softly. "I came to Rothmay prepared for a marriage of cold convenience, the kind my mother always warned me were the most any woman of our circumstances could genuinely hope for. I did not expect to find a husband who noticed a passing remark about missing books, who asked permission before every intimacy, who trusted me with the truth of his family's schemes rather than leaving me to face them blind." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with fingers that no longer trembled with uncertainty, only with something warmer. "I find I love you, Julian. Not the Duke of the settlement papers, not the convenient arrangement that saved my family's fortunes. You." Something in his expression broke open entirely at that, raw and unguarded in a way she had never yet seen from him. And when he kissed her this time, there was no careful restraint left in it at all, only the full, unguarded weight of a love neither of them had expected to find in a bargain struck to satisfy a dead man's will. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and Rothmay Abbey settled into a warmth that Stones had not known in years. Josiah Mabb's roof was repaired before the first snows of that winter, along with every other neglected cottage across the estate's eastern boundary, funded in part by the recovered sums Holloway had skimmed and returned in full as a condition of Julian's mercy toward him. Dr. Aldous Finch received, at Iris's quiet insistence, a standing invitation to visit Rothmay each summer, an invitation the old physician accepted with evident delight, arriving each June with new botanical specimens for the library and endless stories that made even the most sullen members of the household staff laugh over supper. Mrs. Prescott, who had watched 3 years of grief settle over Rothmere like a permanent frost, found herself, by the following spring, humming while she oversaw the linen inventories, a small habit she would have denied entirely if anyone had been unkind enough to point it out to her. Iris took up her mother's love of botanical illustration in earnest that first year, filling the margins of the estate's account books with small, careful sketches of the mullein flowers she found on her morning walks, until Julian, watching her work by the fire one evening, quietly commissioned a proper studio to be built in the unused east wing, flooded with northern light, where she might pursue the work in earnest rather than crowded into the corners of her ledgers. Word of Percival Vane reached him only twice more in the years that followed. Once, a brief notice that he had accumulated further debts in Vienna and been forced to flee yet again, and a second time, some years later, a simple report of his death in reduced circumstances on the continent, unmourned by whatever family remained willing to acknowledge a connection. Julian read the second notice in silence, folded it carefully, and set it in the fire without comment, and Iris, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames, understood that whatever grief or anger her husband might once have carried toward his cousin's schemes had, by then, long since burned itself out into something closer to simple, quiet relief that the matter was finally, truly closed. Mr. Halloway, true to the terms of his confession, left the district entirely within the month, taking a modest position as a clerk in a distant county where his name carried no history, and his second chance, Julian privately hoped, might yet be put to better use than his first. The new steward Julian engaged in his place, a careful, sharp-eyed young man recommended by Dr. Finch himself, worked directly under Iris's supervision for the better part of a year before either of them fully trusted the estate's accounts to run themselves again without her daily oversight, a caution Iris never once regretted, and one that left Rothmere's finances, by every measure that mattered, healthier than they had been in a generation. 5 years after their wedding day, on a bright summer morning with the moles in full bloom beyond the tall windows of a nursery, Iris sat with her daughter, Margaret Rose, named, at Iris's own gentle insistence, in honor of the first Duchess whose memory they had fought so hard to protect, perched on her knee, while their son, a serious, dark-haired boy of 3 who had inherited his father's watchful, careful eyes, toddled after Julian across the lawn below, shrieking with a particular, delighted terror of a child being chased by a parent who loved him beyond all measure. Julian caught the boy up in his arms, swinging him high enough to draw a fresh peal of laughter, and looked up toward the nursery window where Iris sat watching, his face breaking into the wide, unguarded smile that had once been so rare and was now, blessedly, an everyday part of the life they had built together. He raised a hand in greeting, and Iris raised her daughter's small hand in return, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever cold, practical bargain had first brought them together, the love that had grown from it was entirely, unmistakably their own. If Iris and Julian's journey from a marriage of necessity to an unbreakable partnership moved you, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who believes the deepest love often grows in the quietest places, and subscribe to the channel for more sweeping historical romances full of hidden secrets, fierce loyalty, and love stories worth fighting for. Drop a comment below. Would you have confronted Percival the way Iris did? Let me know, and I will see you in the next story.